I had a request from a lovely lady called Shefika from Facebook, who asked me to do this particular project. There are many cultural, philosophical uses of the eye symbol, but in a nutshell, it represents protection and a good luck charm. The first one I did was like this, but I've worked out an easier version for this tutorial, which just involves a bead placed at the center. And the ones I've made, you can see this one spins around, so you can glue a little diamante on it, you can glue a bit of wire on it and make the center of the eye. And you can also attach or bind some circles at the base to have some dangles. So there's so many variations and options for you to play with. I've made them quite big, and you can also use them just to hang in your house. But here I've done a template of the size that I wanted the actual eye to be. So if you don't want it as big, draw out your oval template to the size that you want and use that as your guide. So I've used a piece of string to get the outer perimeter length so that I know how much wire to cut. There's 4 inches there, and I'm using 0.8, that's 20 gauge, 0.8 of a millimeter. So I'll cut that length from my spool to create the oval template or the oval frame of the eye. So I find it easier to begin with just curving the wire. So that's going to be the top, and then I'm going to bring the 2 ends together. So you can just place it on your template, so that gives you the sort of the curve shape, and then you'll know where to bend it in. So that's basically where I use my tips of my chain nose pliers to get that bend. And then I'm going to just use, see, my thumb to create that slight curve. You don't really need a former or anything to bend around. Your thumb is enough because it's a very gentle curve. So once you've got one side, place it back on your template, and then you know where to bend the other side. As I say, mine is quite big for the tutorial, and I like big chunky jewelry myself, but if you want to make something smaller and a little bit more delicate, by all means make a smaller oval. So now I have my shape, and I bring the 2 cut ends together, and then I will cut through, and that will be the complete outline. So I just try and bring those 2 ends, even though they're not soldered and they're not connected, but that gives me my outline. So that's my start. The next bit is going to be the eyelashes. So I do the same, measuring with my piece of string. That just gives me an idea of how long I have to make the row of eyelashes. I'm going to do them in 2 parts. I found it easier than creating a long length and then having to bend it around the oval. So I've got my, I know it's about 2 inches I need to make, and I'm going to leave just over an inch protruding at the end or projecting at the end. So start in a good inch in, and then bend around. So I'm using the height of my flat-nosed pliers to create that right angle bend, and then I scooch it together or bring it together so it runs parallel, and then twist it sideways to a right angle so that one wire sits behind the other. And then I bend it back, so I've got to always think I'm making these little rays or the eyelashes on a straight line. Then leave a gap and then bring it back around the pliers to create the next eyelash. So again, double it up, squeeze it, turn it round so one wire sits behind the other, and then make a space again. So I'm using my chain nose pliers to create that little space, and my flat nose pliers to create the height of each of the eyelashes. And I'm going to create a row of 2 inches. Do you remember I measured the length along the top, and I want a 2-inch length of these eyelashes. So I carry on like that to create the whole row, and you can see I'm bending and forming. So it's very much a repetitive movement. Once you've got it, you just go into repetition. Sorry, I'm a bit out of camera here. I was trying to hold it near myself, and then I tend to bring it out of shot. So you just keep going, and don't worry if it's not perfect. You know you're not a machine. The gaps might be slightly different. The bending might be not as close. I always think there's something wonderful about handmade jewelry that it gives it that sort of look. Right, so I didn't want you to watch me do the whole 2 inches. So there's my one I made earlier, and you can see that will sit at the top or the base, whichever side you want to put it, because they're both going to be the same. So you want to make 2, one for the top, one for the base. So there's the second one. So put those aside, and then you're going to get some 0.4 millimeter binding wire. So the 0.4 is going to be bringing everything together. So cut a nice long length, sort of an arm's length. And what I decide to do is, you know where that's where the join is. That little area is where the join is. So that's the weakest point of my frame. And that's where I'm going to start. Because if I don't start there, the whole thing will become floppy and can open up. So I'm going to take my binding wire and attach it to the center and bring that to where my join is. Not right over the join, just after or before the join. And I'm going to start by binding the 2 pieces together. So I'm binding the eyelashes to the side of the frame on one side of the join. So you bind, don't pull too tight, but bind it close. So just start very gently, because you don't want to, sort of change the shape, which can so easily be done because it's sort of open at that area. And small little bindings. Keep your finger over the gap. The main thing is to grip that open space of the frame with your fingers as you're binding, so that it doesn't misshape. And then go on the other side. So I've worked one side on one side of the binding, and now I'm going to go to the other, because I want to make sure that the frame doesn't open up at the cut end. And you can just sort of flatten this down, but work very carefully and slowly to start with. I mean, there are many other ways of making this frame. You don't have to have this cut end there, but I found, I tried many ways, and I found this was the easiest way. Once I sort of started carefully, and once I'd got it bound, then the whole thing became strong. So, but obviously, this is my version, and you can try your own version. So once I've got the binding done over that open cut ends of the frame, then I can actually proceed much faster, because the thing is held in place, and then it's lots of little bindings in between those eyelashes, and then on to the next gap, and in between the next set of eyelashes, and so forth. So again, lots of repetition in this tutorial. You'll just once you've sort of cemented that middle bit, you'll feel you can sort of be binding much more easily. So I'm there now, so I can just keep going round and around and around. And you want to keep the bindings nice and neat, so you scooch them up, keep them close together, because obviously they're on view, they're not going to be hidden by anything else. So you can see all the workings of all the wire here. So the binding is part of the pendant. And then the areas of the eyelash that are protruding or projecting, you want to bend them so that they sit out to the sides. So there I have it. I've bound all the way round the top, and now I've got to put the second row of eyelashes and bind that to the base. So just make sure they're nice and the wires are behind each other every time. And it's so flexible that it will be easy. So again, I like to start binding from the center. I just find it easier to work from the center. That way, also, if I run out of wire, I can just cut another bit and work to the end. So this time it's nice and solid. I don't have to worry about that gap anymore, and I can just do lots of little bindings and come in between each of these rays much easier than the first one. So I'm just going to continue doing that until I've done the whole piece. So there we have the top, the base. If you've got any binding wire left over, just cut it off and flatten it down. You don't want to keep any of the binding wire, but you'll have two pieces on each side of the 0.8 from the top and the bottom of the eyelash pieces. So what you're going to do is take one of them, and it's up to you which one, and just wrap one of them around the other. So one stays sitting out on each side, and the other one gets wrapped around. And so you've got these two pieces on the side. And then just check that the pieces that you've wrapped around are roughly the same length, because you're going to make little decorative spirals out of them. One is a bit longer, so I'm just going to, you see, those are the two protruding pieces or projecting pieces. And I'm just going to make a tiny little spiral to make it a little bit more decorative at the sides. So you know what to do. It's just a little circle or spiral, and then you roll the wire around itself, and then just pop that and flatten it down right at the edge there, and that gives you a little decorative piece. You don't want this to be too big because it's the middle bead that's going to be the feature of your piece. So it's just a little decorative detail. So the other side is the same. You got rid of that wire and you spiral it down and then flatten it so that it sits at each side of the eye. So there's the actual framework. So now just have a look at it, make sure that it's not been misshaped. You can sort of open it up more depending on the bead you're going to use. You make sure the eyelashes or the rays of the eyelashes are sitting in the right formation, because after you've bound the whole thing, it can be, get a little bit distorted. And then you've got to find a bead. So you can either go for a big, solid, round bead that fits in the center, or you can go for an oval bead that fits, or you can I made a wire frame here to show another version, and you could put a few beads. This is a sort of a Turkish eye bead that I've wired in the middle. You could make a spiral, just be creative at this point. They can, each one you make will be very different. I think I'll go for the oval just for the simpleness of this tutorial. So I'm cutting 0.4 millimeter wire, the soft binding wire that I had, and I'm going to use that to connect the bead at the center. So I'm binding the middle of it at the center of the eye. So I've got two strands then coming down, and because it's quite thin wire and my bead is quite big, I'm going to twist those two wires together. If you have a very light bead and a smaller piece, obviously you can just use the 0.4 on its own. Because my bead is quite big, I felt I needed to double it. So I'm just twisting them together to make it a little bit more sort of, a little stronger, I suppose, for the bead. So twist the wires together so it's doubled, and then you can feed or thread your bead onto the doubled twisted wire, and that will give it a bit more strength, and then just bind it at the other side. So you can always, if your bead is slightly smaller, just squeeze the frame together a bit more to fit, or you can add a little seed bead, the top on the base as a filler. There's all sorts. You just have to, depending on beads you're using and the frame and the size, it'll all differ. So this is just a very vague outline of the project, and then you can make it your own. So I've got my bead in now. So there we've got the eye. That's the frame ready. And now we're going to put it into a frame. Of course you can make a square, you can make a circle. I mean, this one I've glued pieces on my bead. So that's just something you can add to your bead if you want to. The next bit of the project is the frame. I've made a circular frame to sit the eye inside. You could do, a circular frame is the easiest frame you can do. I mean, if you want to do a triangle, if you wanted to do a square, if you wanted to do, another sort of frame, of course, by all means. But it's much better to put it in a frame so that if you're going to wear it, it's going to be a pendant and not a piece of wall art or something you're going to hang off the wall. Then the frame will mean that those little eyelashes, if you wear it as a pendant, they'll get hooked onto all sorts of things like mohair jumpers and scarves. And so a framework gives you a sort of a setting for it. So I've made the circle. I'm just creating a little link on the circle, and I'm going to hook that around the circular frame. Just use your pliers, a few little movements, squidge that round. I'm actually using 1.6mm aluminium wire because it's so light and it's easy to manipulate, but your frame can be made out of twisted wires of 0.8, can be made out of anything, but this is nice and chunky, light, and very quick and easy to use. So there's my circular framework. I'm now going to hammer it. So I just want to make it tougher because aluminium wire is very soft. This will work hard on it, and I like the look of the hammer metal as an outer frame. So I'm flattening it, spreading it, and work hardening it with the steel end of my Whammer hammer. And because I want a little bit of sort of bling to it, I'm going to put the planishing head on my Whammer hammer as well and give it a bit of texturing. So if you hammer the flattened wire, you'll see it'll give little dents, and that will reflect the light when it's worn, or if you're going to use it to hang off something. So you see, it just gives it a nice sort of little dimpled look which will reflect the light beautifully. So there's my framework, and now I'm going to connect and secure the eye at the center of the frame. So I've got those two projecting wires, and so I sort of mark where I need to bend them on each side, because otherwise I might, if I don't mark it, I might sort of pull it too much to one side because I have to leave a little gap. If you're worried, you can always put a few beads on each side so you can mark where you want to bend. But I'm going to hold it on the frame, and then if the eyelash is in the way, just bend it out of the way for the the time that you can just bend it around, and then you can push it back again at the end. So just bring it around, do it slowly, and then just make sure it's secure, squeeze tightly onto one side of the frame, and then you do the same on the other side of the frame. So there we are. Just bring it around very carefully. You want to keep it tight, you don't want it loose. And you only need 1 or 2 binds. I mean, 1 bind will do because my bead is so light. um, and then cut off any excess and use your pliers to squeeze and flatten and make sure it's tightly gripped to the side. So now you've just got the top end to finish off. You've got the projecting end, which is going to be where you're going to suspend it. Yeah, just make sure it's all flattened and nice and neat. And then you could put a bead there. So if you have a bead that actually fits the 0.6, no, I don't think I have a bead. I didn't pick one out to do this. So what I'll do is I'll use my 0.6 aluminium wire again and create a little coil. So this is a little bit like making jump rings really, but I'm making it much smaller. So I'm going to the tips of my round nose pliers and creating a tight coil. This is always useful to know when you don't have a bead that fits the wire, because you're creating what I call a coiled bead. It's just like a little spacer, and that can sit at the top to set it off. And then you want to make your suspension link at the top. So you can either cut it off and make a small suspension link or a wrapped link, or you can take your bail maker pliers and curl the wire around and around and around until it sits to the top of the coil, and you've got a doubled loop at the top. If there's a little bit of a tail, just cut off that tiny bit of the tail, so that you've just got the two wires or the two circles at the top, and you can just sort of prise those open a little bit to give a little space between the two, so when your cord or your chain or whatever you're going to hang it from threads through, you can, sort of it sits sort of more spaced out, and it just adds another detail really. So you can see if I put a chain through the top, you can see what that looks like. So there you have it. That's all you need to do. And you can vary yours with binding a row of little circles to the base, so you can have something hanging. And you'll see a few variations right at the end of this tutorial. So thank you for watching.